Hola a tothom, bona tarda a tots i a totes. Moltíssimes gràcies per estar aquí. Bé, jo soc na Carme Muñoz i ell és en Jordi Riera. Som els codirectors del màster en Innovació Social, Entendre per Transformar, que estem construint constantment i que esperem que finalment en octubre del 2022 puguem dur a terme. En el marc del màster hem organitzat diversos diàlegs d'innovació social. Degut a la situació de pandèmia i la situació que hem estat visquent aquests 2 darrers anys, desgraciadament tots han estat online, però per sort tenim avui en Jeanne Liedtka. We are a very big pleasure to stay here with you, Jeanne, que ha pogut venir des dels Estats Units i hem pogut fer el primer diàleg d'innovació social presencial en el marc del màster. Donar-vos les gràcies a tots i a totes i a nivell tècnic crec que, no sé, si qualcú té qualque problema mos avisau, però heu de tenir l'aplicació de Zoom baixada en el telèfon mòbil, vos heu de connectar al wifi de Fundació Nostra i a través de l'aplicació heu de triar la selecció idioma que vulgueu, anglès, i escoltareu en Jeanne i en Josep en anglès o en castellà i escoltareu en Silvana, la nostra traductora, intèrpret. I res, moltíssimes gràcies i dono la paraula a en Jordi, també vos doni la benvinguda.
Bé, això, el primer de tot, jo no som en Jordi Riera, som en Jordi Llebrés, i en Diego Riera, que també aprofitaré per no el farem pujar aquí, però el de Riera ve per en Diego, no? Ja sabeu que tota aquesta història és un mix, és un compon contra Esment, Fundació, la Caixa, Obra Social, la Caixa i la Universitat. Hem fet un bon trio i ara només ens falta posar el màster en marxa. La pandèmia no ens ha deixat, ho hem intentat un parell de vegades, la cosa ha de ser presencial perquè online ja n'hi ha molts altres, la cosa ha de ser presencial per ens veure i avui és el primer acte que hem pogut fer així presencial, aprofitant que la gent era per Europa, l'hem pogut fer venir a un preu més assequible. Per tant, res, moltes gràcies per ser aquí, espero que disfrutem tots de la xerrada que tindrem amb en Josep. Thank you for coming, thank you very much. I res, esperem que sigui el primer acte d'altres actes que acabin conduint en ja fa molt de temps que xerram del màster d'Innovació Social. Espero que sigui de profit a tots i moltes gràcies per ser aquí.
Gràcies.
Los problemas que estamos afrontando últimamente son mucho más complejos de lo que estamos acostumbrados y por eso es una de las razones por las cuales intentamos buscar nuevas formas de abordarlos. Esta frase, que es así tan sencilla, pues la he sacado de uno de los libros de Jeanne Liedtka, que me ha sorprendido mucho porque de una forma muy sencilla te explica el enorme reto que tenemos en el mundo de la innovación social, que es donde estáis la mayoría de vosotros, ¿no? Problemas complejos como, por ejemplo, problemas que han aparecido de la nada, que nunca habíamos vivido, creo que no hace falta decir cuáles, ¿no? Incluso problemas que ya existían, pero que están atacando a muchísima más gente, como por ejemplo el tema de la salud mental, el tema de la exclusión social. Si a esto le metes las nuevas tecnologías, cómo nos comunicamos, que ha cambiado totalmente, que lo que ocurre en una parte del mundo afecta a la otra, lo metes en una coctelera y te queda un panorama pues, como bastante incierto, ¿no? Y luego, por otra parte, el que tenemos que encontrar nuevas formas de trabajar. ¿Qué significa eso? Quizá tenemos que desarrollar habilidades que todavía no tenemos, como por ejemplo analizar un contexto global o mundial o tratar de descubrir cómo empatizar mucho más con la gente que tiene esos problemas. Quizá tenemos que replantearnos la estructura de las organizaciones. Este concepto de equipos tan rígido, pues quizá ya no es la mejor opción. O cómo financiamos los proyectos de innovación, quizá eso también tiene que cambiar. Bueno, un montón de preguntas todavía sin respuesta y para ello hemos traído ya yo creo que una de las mayores expertas mundiales con muchísima experiencia tanto a nivel docente como acompañando a empresas a mejorar pues, este mundo en el que vivimos. Así que un aplauso por favor para Jeanne Liedtka. Thank you, Jeanne, for coming. Well, first, let's start with the important Me?
How's that? Better?
So let's start with the important thing. Are you enjoying Mallorca?
Who could not enjoy Mallorca? You would have to be a very sad person to come to Mallorca and not enjoy it. So, my husband is here with me, and we have been playing tourist very happily for several days and just loving every minute of it.
Great. We are happy. Jeanne, what has changed in the last decades to now consider to change how we are working in the organizations regarding to the social innovation?
I think a great deal has changed. When I've probably been researching topics around innovation for about 15 years now. And when we first started asking managers in organizations about their role in innovation, they would look at us with a blank look in their face and say, we don't have anything to do with innovation. We have a research and development department. We have a new business department. But innovation has nothing to do with my job, right? And of course, where we sit today, we know that innovation is everyone's job. No matter what organization you work in, no matter what level of the organization you work in or who you work with, we know that part of surviving in a changing, uncertain world is to continue to adapt and to look for new and better ways of doing things. And so this whole idea of who owns innovation, I think, has shifted dramatically. We still have research and development departments in business organizations, of course, and we still have people who do new business development. But I think everyone now really understands that our job is to make things better for the people we serve. And so I think that has just changed dramatically during the last 10 years even that I've been working.
And how can you deal with the fact that people at the organizations are completely flooded with the day-to-day work? They are like doing a lot of stuff and they cannot have the time to think in the future. How can we combine the day-to-day work with the innovation?
I think there's some different ways. One is that our sense of what is efficient, I think, is often false. So in most business organizations, the world I come from, efficiency is probably our dominant value. Get it done quickly, be decisive, do it fast, come up with an idea and get it out there, right? That's what we value. But so often the ideas that we come up with only appeal to us, not to the customers that we're trying to serve. But we measure time in terms of putting something new in the market, not whether it's successful once it's there. And so for me, design thinking asks that we slow down and take the time to really understand the problem and understand what the world looks like from the people's perspective that are living in the problem. And that is very hard to do in a lot of organizations. People are pressured and they don't think they have the time to innovate. But if we don't make the time to innovate, tomorrow will never be any better than today, and we'll be fighting the same fires on the same little hamster wheel that we're on. So I think we need to think differently about time, but those of us who are responsible for teaching innovation, we have to understand that although we love design thinking, it certainly consumed the last 10 years of my life, nobody I work with really cares about design thinking. They have problems they want to solve, and they care about solving their own problems. So we have to bring tools to people and allow them to solve the problems they want to solve, not teach them something new because we think it's important, right? But instead show them how these new approaches allow them to solve problems more effectively than they were able to solve them without them.
What you said about the importance of being aware of understanding the problem resonated me a lot. And how do you deal with The more complex the problems are, the more complex the organizations become. So the big structures, a lot of huge processes. So the consequence I'm observing at several organizations is that there's a big distance between the people working in the organization and the outside, the final client or the user. How can we reduce this distance so that we try to understand what's happening outside?
Yes. Well, I think most of us have a strong desire for control, right? And as leaders of organizations, we feel a responsibility for the outcomes of the organization. So we feel as though it's important that we feel that we are in control of the organization. But there's very interesting theories now around the state of complexity, or what are called adaptive systems, right? And what that research tells us is that the more you try to control a system that is changing rapidly and uncertainly, the worse you make it, right? So as we try and control organizations from the top, right, we are moving in the wrong direction, as you say, because the knowledge, the local intelligence to make the best decisions is at the front line, right? So how do we create new ways of making decisions that recognize that? Well, to a great extent, I believe in this notion that we have to give people tools, not rules. Right? It's very difficult to make rules about what people are supposed to do today, right? Instead, we give them the tools that we can work together to make good choices, and we get clear on what our strategy and our values are about, right? So that people have more freedom to act within the larger strategy, right? Now, we can't have everyone in an organization deciding the strategic direction of the organization, of course, but everyone has a voice in how to achieve that strategic direction, right? And my old world was strategic planning. That is the world I grew up with. I was a strategy consultant for many years. And I just think we invite very few people into these important conversations. And until people are included in the conversation, and the conversation is safe enough to share what we truly believe, then we will continue to waste a lot of money and make a lot of foolish choices with the best of intentions, but because we lack the information we need to make good decisions.
And this new paradigm, this new way of seeing the organization means that we have to be more ready to fail, because innovation is about failing soon, to learn sooner. How can we adapt the leadership style to make the failure something that is natural and even encourage the failure?
Yes. Well, no one likes to fail, whether it's fast or slow or cheap or expensive. I mean, if we have to fail, we'd prefer to fail cheaply, at least. I'm not so sure that we'd rather fail fast than drag it out, right? But what we're really talking about is substituting a sense of learning for what we call failure, right? There are what we would call stupid mistakes, right? And no one should ever have an excuse to make stupid mistakes, right? Now that we talk so much about experimentation in the world of business, now I get very frustrated because for me, some people think experiments are we just throw stuff out into the market and see if it sells. And that is not an experiment, right? That's not, when those things fail, it is not an intelligent failure. It is a lack of forethought, a lack of planning, a lack of understanding of the customer or the people we serve. And so part of it is to differentiate between bad failures that we should have been intelligent enough to avoid and the inevitable failures that go with living in an uncertain world and trying to create new things. Right? And in that way, we talk a lot about the mindset of a venture capitalist, for instance. You know, one of the most successful venture capitalists out in California in the Silicon Valley, when they invest in 10 businesses, the research says that no more than, at best, 2 of those businesses will succeed, right? They will fail 8 out of 10 times. And that's very significant, though, because when they fail, they don't blame it on themselves. They don't say, oh, we didn't do our homework, we made stupid mistakes, da, da, da. They know that in the environment they live in, failure is inevitable. So the trick is, 1, to have many options, right? If we're only going to succeed 2 out of 10 times, and we only have 1 idea, that's probably not going to work, right? And then the second is to figure out which of those 8 ideas to stop investing in, right? And so they learn to manage risk, whereas most of us have been taught to avoid risk. We've been taught not to take risks if at all possible, but we can never create a new world if we're afraid of taking risks, right? We have to take risks intelligently. And for me, design thinking is a toolkit that is meant to help us manage risk in many cases. And that's how you make the equation work, right? If you teach people how to experiment and to manage the risk and the investment along with their knowledge, if we keep those 2 in sync, then failure is not nearly as painful, right? And so I like to think of converting ourselves from a mindset of failing to a mindset of continuously learning. And but it's still hard. No one wants to fail. I mean, that's terrible to fail, right?
And it connects me with talking about risks and money. The distance between the people who innovate and the people who pay the innovation, it's normally also very high. They are living like in different worlds, speaking completely different languages. Do you have an experience in how to join or at least make them more closer?
Well, I think part of it is the language. Of course, I love designers. I have learned so much from, to me, when I first began working with designers, it was a revelation that people had such different ways of thinking. And we had so much to learn. I think that's what really excites me about design thinking. We have many, many, many ways to make decisions in business, and many of them are very good. But design thinking is different than most of the ways we've got. And that's really where its powerful nature is. But designers can be so frustrating to work with. When I was working on the first book, I was trying to lay out what the thought processes were of designers for business people, because I was trying to teach my MBA students how to benefit from some of the principles of design thinking, but all of the material was designers writing for other designers, or it was the folks at IDEO telling very high-level stories that didn't really help anyone figure out how they actually did anything. So I spent a lot of time asking designers to talk to me about how they made decisions, and they couldn't, literally. It was invisible to them. It was so intuitive to them. It fit so well with the way they were interacting with the world that they were completely blind to it. And so we had to unpack that very carefully, because there was a methodology behind what they were doing. So a lot of times, I think, designers adopt a language and a perspective that is very foreign to business people, very foreign to us. And it makes us afraid as business people to trust and to do the kinds of crazy things sometimes. Designers love to provoke. Right? When I first heard the term provocation, I thought, who uses the word provoke in business? We don't like to provoke people, right? We like to keep them happy, make them think things are good. The last thing we want to do is provoke people and make them angry and make them... But designers and artists, they love to provoke, right? And so I think this question of how we bridge that gap and how we make it safe in business to adopt these new ways of thinking and behaving is where we have spent a lot of our time in our research. And for me, structure is the answer. Designers don't need structure because it is intuitive to them. Business people need structure, right? You can't go into a large organization. You can't take people that have been trained in analytic approaches and then tell them to just do things differently, right? You have to have a process and a set of steps. and a way of measuring outcomes and all of these kinds of aspects that largely we have not had much of in design thinking. And so I think trying to do that work has been an important part of where I've spent my life, because I think it's a tragedy that so many business students graduate without understanding design thinking. Because it's going to be so important to their lives to succeed in the future. So that's my mission.
Great. One final question before I leave you with the presentation. You have been working in the US for several years, but you also know a little bit of the business here in Spain because you have been teaching in very prestigious universities. What can we learn, or what is the difference between the innovation in the US and here in Spain? Do you see any gap, anything that we or you can exchange?
One of the things that has struck me as I've tried to do research in different parts of the world is how comfortable people are talking about mistakes they've made or losses they've had, or just sharing viewpoints and things. I think one of the downsides of the US is we're so ready to share everything with everyone, and that it often creates its own problems. I go out, I mean, those of us from the East Coast of the US who live near New York and Washington, D.C., when you go out to California and spend much time in San Francisco and Los Angeles, they make you crazy. Right? It's a crazy little universe they have, and they think everyone else in the world thinks like they do, and we don't even think like they do on the other coast of America. So it's these ways of thinking can be very odd. But the nice part as a researcher is it's easy to talk to people. The first piece of research we did was interviewing business people who had done a very good job of growing their business in mature markets. Right? So we were trying to understand their behaviors. I think we approached 25 business leaders in the US. 24 of them said, sure, come and talk to me. One of them was busy or something, right? Something. We tried to replicate this research first in Europe and then in Asia. In Asia, we couldn't even find people to talk to. They said there are no organic growth leaders in Asia, and if they're there, they're keeping their heads down and doing things their way. In Europe, there were plenty of leaders, but they had to ask corporate if they had for permission to talk to us, right? Which was very frustrating because corporate never says yes. As a researcher, that's one of the things you learn. When they say, I'm now going to ask corporate, you just move on because corporate it may be 5 years from now, they might say yes, but it isn't worth it. So it said a lot, I think, about the different cultures, how hard it was to get a group of managers to sit down and talk without concerns about whether they had permission to do that or not. And so I think part of that attitude is why entrepreneurship has succeeded and taken root so powerfully in the US, because nobody likes to ask permission for anything. I mean, look at the mask fiasco right now. People don't want to get vaccinated. They don't want to wear masks. Why? Because someone told them to, right? And they refuse to do what people tell them. But for innovation, that's actually good, right? For disease, it's bad. But for innovation, it's good. So I think these kind of changes are very hardwired into us as people.
Great. Not asking for permission. This is one thing we have learned today. Thanks a lot for the conversation. We would love to hear from your presentation. Okay?
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I will try not to talk too long because it is much more interesting to have a conversation than it is to listen to one, I think. But I thought I would just say a few things, and hopefully then you'll have questions and we can talk. The first thing I will say is we all know Moses, right? And for me, there is a myth that creative people are saintly. They're selected by God. They're different. They're not normal, right? When we talk about Steve Jobs, right? When we talk about Elon Musk, when we talk about these people, they are different. And for those of us who grew up being told that we were not the creative ones, we were not those people, we believed that message. Right? I trained as an accountant. That's my undergraduate as an accountant, then went to business school. And so for my whole life, I knew that I was not creative, that my job was to find creative people and help them, because I always knew we needed them and we valued them. When I began to understand design thinking and began to teach it to business school students and managers, and people began to realize that they were creative people. Some of us just needed a little bit more help than others, but it wasn't a miracle to be able to think creatively, right? It wasn't something that we had to wait and hope. It wasn't that we raised our staff and the Red Sea miraculously parted because we were so much more creative than everyone else, right? And so a lot of my effort has been fighting the myth of Moses, right? That innovation was a miracle and something only special people did. I like to argue that one way to cross the Red Sea is to part it. Right? The other way is to build a bridge. Right? Now, there are no lessons for parting the Red Sea, right? But there are many lessons for building a bridge. And for me, design thinking has allowed us to teach bridge building so that we can all become more creative as individuals. And that's its power. A lot of people don't need design thinking. It's funny, designers don't need design thinking, right? Elon Musk and Steve Jobs certainly didn't need design thinking, but the rest of us, many of the rest of us in organizations do. So what makes design thinking different? Again, for me, what differentiates it from almost any other way we make decisions in business is first, this notion of empathy. Now, in business, I used to think that was the same as finding unmet needs. But empathy is really emotional as well as cognitive, right? And so this idea that we start by understanding human beings as human beings, and we understand their emotions, and we understand their unique ways of looking at the world and how they define success, is really very important. In fields like healthcare, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, even the university is a great example. We have experts, right? And we see ourselves as experts, and we believe that we know best. And so often, though we care for our students and we want to do the best thing, when we try and care for them our way, we don't succeed, right? And so this question of starting with the human being and understanding the problem through their eyes, I think is critically important, and it's completely different than being customer-driven, which is what we talk about in the business world. The second thing that is exciting to me about design thinking is it begins with possibilities. Designers and strategists, for instance, will say that any great design has three components. It has possibilities, it has constraints, and it has uncertainties, right? So when we make a decision, we have to put out some possibilities that don't exist now. We have to recognize the very real constraints in our environment. And then we have to recognize the things that we don't control, and we need to have contingencies for those. Often, we begin with constraints in our world. Right? We begin by accepting the way the world is today and what looks possible today. And because of that, we never get to real possibilities. Right? Whereas design thinking says, stand in the future and design as though anything were possible. And the hope is that we get so excited by a possibility that we think creatively about constraints. Right? Again, I think another myth is that the power is having the idea itself, but so often in the real world, having the idea is the easy part. Getting the idea into practice is the hard part. And it often takes more creativity to move an idea into practice than it takes to have the idea itself. Right? And design thinking gives us a chance to generate the enthusiasm to do the hard work of trying to work around constraints. One of my favorite quotes is from Jack Kerouac compatriot, the on-the-road guy. He said, "There's no force in the world more powerful than a man who has just been told he cannot have his own way." Right? And that creativity of wanting things one way and constraints telling us we can't, I think, is where we get really creative about end running those constraints so that we can make things happen that don't seem possible in the moment. And then finally, the third point is this idea of iteration. We don't expect to get the answer right the first time. Again, that takes us back to the venture capitalists. We accept in a world of uncertainty that no matter how hard we try, we will have to learn our way to the best answer, right? And that has a lot of implications. It says that you start with lots of ideas, you whittle those ideas down as you go, you figure out how to conduct fast, cheap experiments, these kinds of things, tools that we have not generally been trained to have. And design thinking, it brings attention on subjects like experimentation. I think experimentation is still the biggest area of weakness in our ability to teach design thinking. I think it's our biggest area of weakness in business organizations in terms of skills. We say, go design an experiment as though anyone has any idea how to actually design an experiment. Right? So I think we have a lot to learn in this one, but at least we know we're supposed to be designing experiments, even if we haven't quite figured out how to teach it yet. So my way of working with business people, in the beginning at least, was to make it very simple and to say design thinking consisted of asking 4 simple questions. What is today? What if we could do something exciting tomorrow? What wows, which for us is the intersection of what the organization needs and whoever you're serving needs. And then finally, what works in the real world as a process of experimentation. What's interesting is we often think if we want to invent a new future, we should jump right to the future. But if we want to be data-driven, and I believe that design thinking is inherently very data-driven. It's just a different kind of data. It's not the kind of data that fits in Excel spreadsheets. It's ethnographic data. It's human data, but it is data nonetheless. If we jump to the future, all we do is invent the world we want to live in. Right? If we don't stay in the present so we understand the problems people have today, we will never invent the future that they want. We'll just keep inventing the future that we want. Right? And so what is absolutely a fundamentally critical process in design thinking, and really it's where it all begins. If we fail to develop good design criteria in that very first stage, chances are we will never really have an idea that creates significant value for the people we're trying to serve. Right? So here's a story of what that looks like, just briefly. This is Monash University Medical Centre in Melbourne, Australia, a really thoughtful group of physicians and nurses and administrators working together and really committed to new ways of thinking and behaving in their practice. One of the particular challenges they faced was in the emergency room, in the acute psychiatric portion of the emergency room. So this would be where people would come who'd had a drug overdose or who'd attempted suicide. And they highlighted it as one of the areas where they knew they were failing, right? And they were failing not just because more and more people were showing up, but because when someone showed up, the interval between their first visit with, say, a drug overdose and their next drug overdose was getting shorter and shorter and shorter. So they had clear evidence that they were failing and had been failing for many years. They had many committees, and those of us from academia appreciate, or business, the endless committees. But they could never really successfully resolve it. Everyone wanted to do what they thought was the right thing, but everyone thought the right thing was something different. And so they sat in conference rooms and argued, which, of course, what people do across different perspectives. Someone got the brilliant idea that they should actually maybe spend some time really understanding what was happening in the life of their patients, and that perhaps then they would be able to break the kind of logjam around what was the right thing to do. So they began to use a technique we call journey mapping, where you follow the journey of whoever it is you're designing for, from the beginning of that journey right through the end. So they began following these people who showed up in the emergency room, trying to understand what had led them to the emergency room, and then in particular, what was happening between when they left the emergency room today and showed back up 2 months later. Here's one of the journey maps that they create. This is Tom's journey map. Tom became a very important person for the people working to solve this problem. So this is Tom's experience between when he leaves the emergency room the first time and when he comes back in the second. Right? Now, you may be wondering why someone would put a slide like this up that you cannot possibly read. Right? But that's the whole reason to put it up there. It's ridiculous. Right? When they actually looked at Tom's experiences, they found that he did have 3 meetings with doctors, but he had 13 different case managers who interacted with him 70 different times. Right? And they handed off 18 different times, and we all know how well handoffs usually go in the hospital. Their records were in 5 different information systems, right? And including, they still had paper records that were even floating around, right? That recognition about what was happening to Tom became a very important theme that people use moving forward. This is one of the doctors speaking who was part of that. And to me, this is very powerful. So I'll just read the whole thing. We can think all kinds of things about how we believe the system is working, but then seeing the reality of how far or how it was really working, it was shocking to see how far from our intentions reality had come. Patients needed someone to be present for them. Despite a flurry of activity, nothing was changing. We needed to feel the blockages and struggles. And then this is one of the physicians who's involved in the process there. And the shock of really understanding the experience they were providing for these patients changed them in fundamental ways and allowed them as a group of different specialties for the first time ever to come together and agree on what they wanted the new experience to look like. Right? It was a huge breakthrough for them and has had great impact, and intervals have been once again lengthened as they should be. Positive things, but I think for me, listening to the physicians talk about the impact on them personally of understanding what was happening to their patients was absolutely critical. So I love that story because it shows a lot of the ways that design thinking works. One is it reframes the problems. So it helps the clinicians go from looking at the world through their clinical lens to instead flipping that and looking at it through the world of their patient, which is fundamentally what opens up new opportunities for innovation. Right? We know that most opportunities for innovation get lost with the definition of the problem. We define the problem so narrowly and so conventionally that we never see the creative ways to act in this situation. Right? So this reframing of the problem is critical. It gives them criteria to make decisions with. One of the things that we have found very useful is to be very explicit about design criteria. Design criteria describe the qualities of solutions, not the solutions themselves. So if anything were possible, this is what any good decision would allow to have happen. This is how patients would feel, right? They would feel cared for, right? And those criteria allow team members to align in common in ways they never could before. Right? Because so often the problem with decision-making is we all carry different criteria into it. We carry the criteria we learned as part of the culture of whatever field or area of expertise we come out of. Then we work with people who have a different field and a different set of expertise, and we talk across each other. We have no shared criteria for decision-making, so instead we debate. right? Or we do something that Herb Simon, when he won the Nobel Prize for Economics, called satisficing, which I've always loved because it perfectly describes about half the faculty meetings I'm in. It's when we pick the least worst solution everyone will agree to. Okay, that is not the world of innovation. Usually the least worst solution that everyone will agree to is far worse than any of the one solutions that people carried into the room, right? And so by aligning people and by emotionally engaging them, right, we've set in place almost the inevitability of good things coming out, right? We've reframed the problem from the perspective of the students, the people we're trying to solve, the patient in this case. We've set an agreed upon criteria that we've achieved alignment on, and we've come to really care whether or not this works, right? When you have people who are engaged and caring, when you have people who are in alignment about what matters, and when they're truly solving the right problems, you can almost step away at that point because you've got in place the motion for a decision that you know will be valuable for people. And in our research, we've now looked at probably 75 different organizations, both in the social sector, healthcare, education, government work, as well as in the for-profit sector. And we see some very tangible outcomes, and I just wanted to spend a minute on those. 4 kind of categories of outcomes, some of which operate like an iceberg very much below the surface and are almost invisible. That's one of the reasons why demonstrating ROI, or return on investment, for some of these new technologies is so difficult, because so much of the good happens in ways that are not measurable. But there are ways to measure things differently, and some of the organizations we studied, like IBM, talks about hot leads, which is coming out of a trade show or something, the number of people who will actually follow up and become candidates to sell something to. Toyota has used the methodology extensively with their customer call centers and reducing not only wait times but satisfaction. Significant effect in healthcare, and in some ways in the US today, I think healthcare is probably the most fertile area for design thinking, with things like reducing emergency room usage, a really critical one. And then Mass Agro is a partnership between the Mexican government and a nonprofit service organization trying to teach new agricultural methods to subsistence farmers. Okay, which is notoriously difficult to do and actually have adoption rates. And again, so we can see things that you can measure, like adoption rates, show increases. There's a deeper level, though, which is changes in perception. Right? So in the business world, we would talk about Net Promoter Score, which is just says to customers, would you recommend us to a friend? We're all used to, now every time we have any transaction, someone asks that, would you recommend to others, right? So we can, that's a perceptual score, but we can measure changes in that. We see in some of the federal government, we've done a lot of work in Washington, D.C., where, believe it or not, there is actual good work going on in the innovation space. People are trying, right? One of the chief outcomes there is employee engagement. People feel more engaged, right? And in turn, employee engagement leads to all other kinds of good business outcomes. We know that already. If we can get higher engagement, we'll get better outcomes, right? We can really see that. Suncorp is a large Australian financial services company. And they had a big merger with an organization called Proxima, which I think was one of the biggest insurers in the area. And they use design thinking as part of managing the merger process to try and keep people committed to the new joint goals and not losing momentum as part of that. So lots of different uses of design thinking. Now, when we start to look at changes in the conversation, they become very difficult to measure. I mean, there is some actually good work coming out of some firms that actually track teams and look at their progress and compare their performance to other teams. And it can be quite dramatic. But this notion of conversation, I think, is one of the kind of hidden benefits of design thinking. For me, I've talked about design thinking as a new social technology. It's a way people can talk and work across difference. that is generally more productive than the way we work across difference right now. Right? Think of the changes in digital technology, even over the last 10 years. Right? Many in this room are too young to remember when we didn't have phones that we carried with us. Right? I mean, it seems inconceivable. We didn't have the internet. Right? I used to have to go to the library to look up articles, right? I didn't have Google Scholar. I mean, it's hard to even imagine that. But think, what's been the progress on the human side associated with all of that digital technology? In some ways, aspects of social media we know are making the world worse. They're making it more difficult for us to get together. People are narrowing their data to only listen to other people they already believe in. It's further polarized us. So part of the question is, where's the new human technology that allows us to have the kind of conversations we have to succeed, right? For me, design thinking can really do that because it can really inherently help around issues of inclusion and equity and diversity in ways that a lot of the methods that we've developed to tackle them head on, I don't think are as effective. Finally, people themselves change. Right? We know, for instance, at Mass Agri, the chief problem in farmers adopting new techniques is that their entire family's livelihood depended on the success of this year's crop. So to an academic agriculturalist, the idea that they wouldn't start doing something new made no sense whatsoever. But to them, it was a huge risk. And so they began planting crops side by side. They would find farmers who were thought leaders in a region, plant the traditional way in one row of crops, plant using the new methodologies in the other, and just wait through the growing season so the other farmers themselves could see the difference. Right? And deal with this fear that they have, and in healthcare with the clinicians coming to see the patient's perspective. Right? Of late, I've spent a lot of my time trying to understand why design thinking changes those who use it. Right? Again, we spent a lot of time arguing that design thinking changes the lives of those we use it for, the patients, the students, the citizens, whoever we're serving. But it only changes their lives because it changes the lives of the people using it first. Right? So this is something that we've been studying based on our work with students. And this will be kind of the last set of remarks is really around this interesting thing. So when we're teaching people design thinking, we're teaching them to do a bunch of stuff, right? That's just a set of activities. We're teaching them to go get research using ethnography. We're teaching them identifying insights, developing design criteria, generating ideas, prototyping, all experimentation, all of this. What's interesting in our work, and this is mostly reading the journals of about 10 years worth of students who've been learning design thinking, and also a group of adults who've been learning it as well, is that they are having experiences that are changing them. So for instance, while they're doing the activity of data gathering, they are actually immersing themselves in the lived experiences of the people they're serving at a level of depth that they have never done before. Right? That immersion in someone else's experience changes people. It not only changes what you do, it changes who they are. Similarly, sense-making. So when we go off and identify insights, we're actually trying to make sense of new data. We're trying to find patterns in it, right? We're struggling with the chaos of trying to find patterns in qualitative data. This magical experience of alignment as these disparate groups come together, like the different clinicians at Monash, right? Where they just grow towards each other out of a common focus on who they're serving, can be very powerful. Emergence, I just think, is one of the most awesome things ever. You know, the phenomenon of emergence is when an idea is formed within a group discussion that no one person could have brought into that discussion. Right? So many of us have a model for decision making. We all have a solution already. We come into the room and we debate different people's solutions. When emergence occurs, and of course emergence is one of the fundamental properties of successful adaptive systems, right? New ways spontaneously emerge out of the conversation and process, right? And that is where the higher order solutions come from, right? Because we begin as a group to see things as possible that none of us were capable of seeing alone when we entered the room, right? That's very profound. As we start and imagine new futures, prototyping is one of the most foreign things to most of us, right? We think, well, how can we build prototypes of things? Even storyboards can seem very strange. But prototyping is much more fundamental. It's imagining a new future as vividly as possible. I mean, what ends up on the storyboard is just the way we capture that. I mean, for me, it all goes back to Stephen Covey, and there's probably not many people in this room who remember the 7 habits of highly successful people, right? Begin with the end in mind. That was Covey's notion. Begin, if we can't vividly visualize a new future, we'll never get anyone else to come with us into that new future. Becomes really critical. And then finally, learning in action, which I've said is so easy to say and so hard to do in organizations. It's even hard to do as an individual, to actually learn and act. Oh, sure, we have actions, but learning from them is a whole different thing. So what we found is as people experience these, they become someone new. Right? Immersion helps them to become both more empathetic and more curious, and curiosity is a really essential thing in all of this, right? We have to be curious about the way things are today, and we have to treat things like surprise as wonderful opportunities to learn instead of bad things, right? As we begin to learn how to make sense, people become confident and they become inspired to believe that they can do this, right? And the confidence, the creative confidence, is such a critical driver of all of these. We learn to collaborate, and we collaborate around the user. It's a very particular form of collaboration. We become comfortable with difference, comfortable with creative tension and conflict. And this is the other problem. You know, higher order solutions only come when you're willing to surface conflicting perspectives and talk about them, right? And again, most of us are as conflict avoidant as we are risk avoidant, right? And so very difficult to teach people how a set of tools that make it safe for them to surface and work with difference, I think, which is, I can't think of anything more needed in our world today than the ability to surface and work with difference in productive ways, right? And then finally, how people become more resilient and adaptive, right? For me, it gets summed up in this wonderful quote from one of the doctors coming out of the design thinking process in Melbourne, where he says, some people have a view of design thinking that if you get a whole bunch of people in a room with Post-it notes, something magical happens. Right? And afterwards, you don't know quite how you did it. Instead, you have to make it clear that there's a rigorous methodology in place that people can learn. We want to be leading edge, not bleeding edge, and you need a very structured methodology that lets you safely work through the elements. Right? And I think that notion of using design thinking tools and techniques to create a safe space, give people confidence that they can be creative, confidence that they will work it out together. I think that's really probably the most significant contribution that it makes. So with that, let me stop talking at you and look forward again to a conversation together.
Thank you. Thanks. So from now on, we would like to open our small talk here with all of you, so you can ask, challenge, comment, everything you want. I have 1,000 of questions here, so can you change your flight to? But before I'm jumping in, I would like to let you some time to just ask or comment, or do you have any insight?
Oh, thank you.
Ines, thank you.
Oh, I think there's a microphone coming your way.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. You made so much emphasis about the confidence and like safe space. How do you encourage to have like safe space to express your ideas or like your thoughts, you know?
Yeah. I think this is really the critical piece of it, right? If people don't feel safe telling the truth, nothing good can come out of an innovation experience, right? I mean, if I trace in business a lot of the really expensive innovation fiascos, you can always find a group of engineers who knew it was never, ever going to work. They just didn't want to tell the CEO that because it had gotten too far along, right? So I think this question of how you create an environment that makes it safe for people to tell the truth is a bit of a chicken and an egg, because of course we're talking about trust, right? Because if I don't trust you to work with the information that I give you productively, then I'm not going to give you that information if I worry that it could come back and reflect badly on me, right? On the other hand, you don't start with trust, you build trust. So how do you have a process that is trust building that really requires trust in the first place, right? And for me, again, that is structured methodology, right? You can say to someone, let's go off and do all this radical new scary stuff, or you can say, look, here's 5 steps. We have 5 steps for everything in business, right? We have a methodology for everything. This is just a different methodology. But here's the set of rules for the way we run the conversation, right? One of the rules that's so powerful in design thinking is this notion of being possibility-driven, right? We know that creative ideas are very fragile, especially early on, and if you allow people to critique as they create them, you will kill them, right? So we want critique, but you have to hold the critique off to a somewhat later stage, allow people to get excited and brainstorm as though anything were possible, and then bring the critique in. Right? And so I think having these rules of the conversation make it a lot easier to get people to talk about things like difference, because you are giving them permission. In fact, it's more than permission. You're kind of insisting that they do it. One of the techniques that we use that, sounds like a kindergarten is you have to go around the table and everyone has to comment before anyone says their second comment. Right, so it's basic turn-taking. Now, we were supposed to learn turn-taking in kindergarten, right? There's nothing very dramatic about turn-taking. But think of most meetings you go to. There's the people who start talking and they literally never stop, right? And no one feels comfortable interrupting them, especially if it's a senior person, right? And then at the end of it, everyone's just kind of exhausted and they just agree to whatever they say and leave the room, and no one has any engagement or commitment as a result of that conversation, right? So basic rules like turn-taking can make a huge difference in what conversations look like. And so I don't think there's, unfortunately we can't wave a magic wand and make psychological safety appear. It really does have to be built over time, but I do think that with the correct structure in the discussion, you can create new kinds of conversations with the right kinds of people. Now, I will tell you, having tried to teach this to business school students in a required class, was very painful. I always think you should start with the people who are already there. People who've been looking for technology like this their whole life, who've been waiting for it, and finally you show up and they get so excited, because it only takes a couple of really cynical students to drive an entire class off the track when you're trying to teach these methodologies. So I do think you need to be very careful about who you put into the conversation in the first place, and then what are the rules of the conversation, and then what are the outcomes coming out of the conversation? What kind of commitments are people making? What's the path forward? Are there the resources to follow through on this? I think that's all part of making it safe and worthwhile to take these personal risks in conversations.
Thank you. One of the things that resonates me a lot from your talk is the concept of seeing the reality. How it changes a lot the perspective of the people. I'm a very fan of the Kanban boards. I'm working with some of the people who are here in the room in applying Kanban, and it's amazing how just a first step of visualizing the situation, it changes everything. It changes the conversation, the perspective. Do you know another way or another technique more than the customer journey you told us about how to visualize a situation to understand the reality?
Well, I think visualizing is one of the great designer gifts that is very hard to teach to non-designers, right? Because, of course, we all think it's about drawing, and we all also know we're bad artists. Not only are we not creative, we can't draw, and we know that going in, right? And so I think one of the things that I have had some success with lately with my students is working with imagery. I think this younger, the younger generation of people who've grown up on lots of images. For instance, the students have to write a weekly paper where they describe where they are that week, and I ask them a question that they answer. And I always invited them to visualize as part of that, to get comfortable with visualizing, and they mostly never did. So now there's a requirement that they have to put a visual in each week's entry. And they're fabulous. I mean, they're so creative. I love reading them, and I laugh. I mean, the things they find, right? So that's clip art. They're just pulling some image off the internet, but it's a metaphor. And they're learning to think in terms of metaphors, which is such a powerful way to think. So when you ask them, so class the next day, I always pick a few of my favorites, and I put them up in my slides, and I say, okay, tell us what's happening. How does this relate to what you're doing? Last week, we were approaching their first deadline, and there was one of a goldfish bowl, a full bowl, and the goldfish is outside of the bowl, just laying next to the bowl. And that was this student's expression of how they were feeling at that moment in class. And so they explained it, and we have these conversations, and it surfaces their feelings and where they really are in a way that just astonishes me. I mean, 20 years of teaching this, and I thought, God, and I never just made them put an image in their journals before. Like, why didn't I think of that before? Because it is working so well. So I think sometimes these, again, small techniques can really help people to begin to use more than just the verbal to capture what they're thinking and feeling.
There's another actor that we haven't been talking about, is the public administration, which in the social sector is a key player for succeeding in innovation. Is there someone here from the public administration? Okay, we can insult them. Now, I wanted to know your vision about this player. How you think they help or they play in this game of innovation?
I think there's a special place in heaven where all of the people who tried to do innovation work during the Trump administration are going to go, because they basically went underground with these efforts. I mean, they had a pretty healthy innovation lab as part of the Office of Personnel Management in DC, and a lot going on, and it kind of just got shut down. And they kind of refused to shut it down. They had their own, they called it FIN. What was it stand for? The Federal Innovators Network, and it was like a secret cell for a while, where they would meet secretly and just give each other emotional support. Because to me, when you talk about constraints, large government bureaucracies, there's nothing worse. I mean, really, we have nothing to compare to it in business. I always think when everyone complains about how hard it is to make change in business, it's like, well, first of all, spend a day at the university and then tell me about it. And then if you're really feeling like you have it bad, go talk to someone in government for a day and see how it is that they make decisions, right? And what it takes to innovate. But again, part of what they've been really good at doing is a very grassroots movement, which to me is one of the beautiful things about design thinking. It really values starting small. Right? And when you're looking at making giant, big changes, it just becomes overwhelming and people give up, right? And yet, I can make changes in my little piece of the world, right? And people do it all the time. When we talk to teachers, we teach this methodology to a lot of public school teachers, and they are used to waiting for permission to do anything, right? So they're waiting for the superintendent to give them permission to use design thinking in their classrooms, right? And you say, well, you know, you could just go into class tomorrow and try a few new things and maybe change the experience of those 20 kids in your class, right? You don't have to reform the world. You can just start by changing a little piece of it. And I think that's such an important message today, because I think there's so much that needs changing. We can just become overwhelmed and feel powerless as individuals to make a difference. And one of the things I love about design thinking, it says, look, you may make some relatively small difference, but it's a big difference in the life of someone else. Right? And so we saw a lot of that in DC. People doing a lot of customer journeys or citizen journeys, really paying attention to different aspects of experience, whether it was in the social justice area or whether it was huge healthcare. There was a lot of great work done, for instance, on the American Indian reservations, where a lot of the medical systems are really underfunded and very challenging, and a lot of cultural issues around them, and just did fabulous things there. A lot of it just by offering people who were interested in being involved in change the opportunity to try. So the one federal government opportunity was at Health and Human Services, 80,000 employees around the US. And they just had a little annual competition, which is if you have a new idea, something that would make the life of citizens in your little world better, tell us about it. And we'll review it. And then they would just pick a certain number of them and put people really into design thinking training. Because, of course, these people had all solved problems, and their solutions really weren't very good because they weren't driven by any deep understanding of customers. But they were the people who wanted to be change makers, who saw themselves as change makers. And they formed networks and worked with each other. And I think sometimes with these big, giant, huge things, yes, we need fundamental systemic change, but I'm not sure how much fundamental systemic change that any one of us can drive at any moment. But if we feel like we can change the things that are around us, then that makes a big difference. And so I think that those were the people who succeeded in Washington in feeling good about the work they were doing over the last few years. And they're still there. I mean, they hung in there. They gave each other the confidence to keep going. And of course, now they're way happier. But they held on through some really tough times.
Thanks. ¿Alguien de vosotros, I'm going to switch to try to connect with them a little bit. ¿Alguien?
Freedom the Riot Act. Some questions going.
¿Alguien de vosotros ha utilizado esto de design thinking alguna vez o habéis tenido alguna experiencia por ahí que pues creo que es un buen momento para compartirlo también con ella? No sé si tenéis alguna historieta por ahí. I'm asking for.
I know.
Okay. ¿No?
We have the
¿Todos?
We used to try the stare down. If you just stare at everyone long enough, someone cracks.
Well, maybe it's time to close. Okay. Just one final tip for any one of these people who wants to start design thinking tomorrow. A first step that we can do. Anything?
Yeah. Again, there's lots of little wonderful steps. Right? I love techniques like journey mapping is one of my favorite. I was thinking, if you give me 2 hours of someone's time to teach them something, I will teach them journey mapping, which is basically just having a conversation with the person that you're trying to help create value for, and having them walk you step by step through their experience and talk about what worked and what didn't work. Right? It's like magic. Business people have a better conversation with just that one little technique that they've ever. You can do it with employees too, like if you're really feeling courageous. See if you can create an environment where usually someone else has to interview people.
Would you do it with the customer, with the real person, the journey mapping? So asking him or her, what's the first step or the first contact you make with the company, and the second and the third? Would you draw it with the person?
I mean, we've done it with our students, and it's fascinating. Of course, you have to train other students to do it because they would never actually tell faculty what they really thought. But it's been a revelation to us how our idea of making students happier is to change the curriculum, right? And of course, I mean, these students, they could care less. The curriculum, they're totally neutral on. They don't hate it, they don't love it. What they want is, tell me how to get a job, and why am I not invited to the right parties? So those are the two basic drivers of student satisfaction from what we can tell. And that's good, because we've wasted a lot less time on curriculum reform lately, arguing with each other, knowing that we weren't beginning to touch what was really mattering to us. So I think a lot of it is just these basics. A lot of people in organizations, as you said earlier, don't ever really talk to a customer. So just forcing someone to actually go talk to one of their customers or one of their patients, it can often be a revel, and not talk to them by giving them instructions or telling them to do something, but literally have a conversation where we try and understand their experience and what's working and what's not working in it. These are really simple ways to begin. You don't need a statistically significant sample. I mean, oftentimes we like to interview, say, 15 to 20 people is a number we usually give students, if they're doing a real project for a real company. But you can interview one person and learn something you didn't know. So the excuse that I don't have time to interview 19 other people, so I'm not going to start, is just foolish. Start with one, right? And you'll learn something, almost guaranteed, right? And you'll find it a motivating enough experience that you'll want to talk to a second one, right? So again, part of it is just kind of getting people in motion, getting them to try a couple of these small techniques in low-risk areas where you're not asking them to take a lot of chances, and getting them more comfortable with these ways of thinking and behaving, and the next thing you know, they're willing to tackle bigger and bigger things.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Jeanne, for the talk. I enjoyed a lot being here with you. I hope you also enjoyed the talk. Any final thought, question from your side? So big applause for...
Thank you for inviting us to this absolutely beautiful place, which we are having a wonderful time touring as well. So thank you.
Thanks a lot for coming. Thank you.